Gideon Price moved through the dark stable with the quiet certainty of a man who believed he would never be caught. He stopped at the third stall, unlatched the gate, and pressed a soaked rag against Raven's muzzle. Not long enough to kill, but long enough to make the fever worse. Long enough to make certain no one could save him in time. The stallion shuddered. Gideon stepped back, latched the gate, and walked out into the night like he had simply gone to check the water troughs. He had done it 3 times already. He would do it a 4th if he had to, because a dead horse meant a broken rancher, and a broken rancher meant Margaret Whitlock could move in and take everything Elias Boone had spent 20 years bleeding to build. If this is your first time here, we would love to have you with us. Please subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. And if this one pulls at something in you, hit that like button and drop a comment, letting us know what city or country you're watching from. It means more than you know to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Vivian Hartley stepped off the stage in Silver Creek with $14 folded inside her boot, a scuffed leather case that had belonged to her father, and the specific kind of tiredness that doesn't come from a long journey, but from years of being told you don't belong somewhere before you've even arrived. She was 31 years old. She had dark brown hair she kept pinned back because loose hair was impractical, and brown eyes that people sometimes found unsettling because they didn't look away when they probably should have. She was not a small woman. She had her mother's wide shoulders and her father's steady hands. And she had learned early that some people decided things about her the moment she walked into a room before she had said a word. Silver Creek decided things quickly. It was that kind of town. The main street ran straight and dusty between 2 rows of wooden buildings that had been thrown up fast and repaired poorly. There was a general store, a land office, a saloon that doubled as a dining room after 5 o'clock, a telegraph office, and a building with a hand-painted sign that read, Dr. Calhoun, Livestock Medicine and Farriery. The sign was faded. Whoever had painted it hadn't bothered to fix the letters that had started to peel. Vivian stood in front of that sign for a moment, reading it twice, before she picked up her case and pushed the door open. The man behind the counter was somewhere north of 60, heavy-set, with the slow blink of someone who had decided long ago that surprises were not worth his energy. He looked at Vivian the way men in his position often looked at her. A quick inventory that started at her face, moved to her case, and landed on a conclusion before she'd opened her mouth. "Help you?" he said. "I'm looking for work," Vivian said. "Veterinary. I trained under my father for 9 years, and I've been practicing independently for 3. I have references from ranches in Colorado and one in... I don't have work," the man said. "You haven't heard what I'm offering." "Don't need to." He turned back to whatever he'd been doing. "I've got 2 boys that handle the large animal calls. Don't need a 3rd. Vivian did not move. "Are you Dr. Calhoun?" "I am." "Then you know the Boone Ranch has had 3 unexplained horse deaths in the last 8 months. That made him look up. "I heard about it on the stage," Vivian said. 2 of the other passengers were talking. They said Elias Boone is losing animals and nobody can figure out why. She set her case on the counter. "I can figure out why." Calhoun studied her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not respect exactly, but something adjacent to it. Caution, maybe. "You're a woman," he said finally. "Yes," Vivian said. "I've been one my whole life. It hasn't stopped me yet." He almost smiled. Then he didn't. "Boone doesn't like strangers on his property. Particularly not..." He paused. "Particularly not women," Vivian finished for him. "I understand. Thank you for your time." She picked up her case and left. She stood on the boardwalk outside and breathed through her nose for a moment, the way her father had taught her when she was 8 years old and a neighbor's boy had laughed at her for trying to splint a dog's broken leg. "You don't cry in front of them," her father had said. "You breathe, then you go back and you do the thing anyway." Vivian breathed. Then she started asking around town about Elias Boone. What she learned came in pieces, the way information always did in small frontier towns where people were generous with facts and stingy with context. Elias Boone had owned the Double B Ranch for going on 22 years. He had built it from a single parcel of land and a handful of cattle into something substantial, a working cattle ranch with a reputation for good horses. He had a foreman named Gideon Price, who had been with him for 12 years. He had lost his wife 6 years back, a fact that people mentioned in the same flat voice they used to mention the weather, like grief was just another condition of the climate out here. He was private, He was difficult. He did not ask for help and did not welcome it when it arrived uninvited. His prize stallion, a black horse named Raven, had been sick for 4 days. That last part came from a boy sweeping the floor of the general store, who had heard it from a ranch hand who had come in for supplies that morning. "They say old Doc Calhoun already went out and looked," the boy said. "Said there wasn't nothing to do. Said the horse was done." Vivian bought $2 worth of supplies she needed, tucked them into her case alongside the instruments her father had left her, and hired a horse from the livery stable. The man at the livery wanted $4 for a day's rental. She talked him down to $2.50 by pointing out that the horse he was offering her had a stone bruise on his left front hoof that was going to get worse if he didn't treat it, and she would treat it now in exchange for the discount. He agreed, mostly out of curiosity. She treated the hoof in 12 minutes, loaded her case into the saddlebag, and rode out toward the Double B. The ranch appeared over a low rise in the late afternoon when the light was coming in sideways and turning everything amber. It was larger than she'd imagined. A main house, 2 long bunkhouses, an equipment barn, and a stable block that had been built with more care than anything else on the property. Someone cared about those horses. That much was clear from a distance. A man intercepted her before she reached the gate. He was tall, rangy, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and now just looked like it had been through things. He had a foreman's bearing, the straight back, the deliberate slowness of someone who was used to being in charge of how fast things moved. "Private property," he said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I know," Vivian said. She stayed on the horse. Getting down felt like a concession she wasn't ready to make. "I'm a veterinarian. I heard your stallion is sick. I'd like to take a look at him." Doc Calhoun already looked. "I know. I'd like to look anyway." The man stared at her. "Who are you?" "Vivian Hartley. I trained under Daniel Hartley out of Denver. Before that, work in Colorado, ranches for—" "I didn't ask for your history," the man said. "I asked who you are." "Those are the same question," Vivian said. Something tightened in his jaw. "Boone doesn't want visitors." "I imagine he doesn't, but his horse is dying and I might be able to help. Is that worth 5 minutes of his time?" A long pause. The man— she didn't know yet that his name was Gideon Price, didn't know yet what he was— looked at her case, looked at her face, and made a calculation. She would think about that calculation later. She would understand, later, that what she'd read as reluctance was something else entirely. "Wait here," he said. He walked toward the main house. Vivian waited. She used the time to look at the stable block. Even from this distance, she could see that one of the stall doors was different from the others, slightly ajar, like someone had left it in a hurry. She could hear, or thought she could hear, a sound from inside. Not a whinny. Something lower, more effortful. Gideon came back with another man. Elias Boone was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. He was in his mid-40s, with the build of a man who worked outdoors with his hands and had for a very long time. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples. He had a face that was hard to read, not because it showed nothing, but because it showed several things at once. Exhaustion, weariness, something that in another light might have been grief. He wore his grief the way men who'd been raised not to show it always wore it. Somewhere behind the eyes, visible only if you were looking for it. He looked at Vivian the way the whole town had been looking at her all day. "Calhoun says the horse is gone," Elias said. His voice was flat, not unkind, just flat, the way a man sounds when he's already made peace with something and doesn't want to have to unmake it. "Calhoun might be right," Vivian said, "but I'd like to look before we accept that." "Why?" It was a fair question. She answered it honestly. "Because I've seen horses that looked done and weren't, and I've seen veterinarians give up because they were tired or busy or just not interested enough to look harder." She held his gaze. "I'm interested. I have nowhere else to be. Let me take 10 minutes with your horse, and if I don't see anything Calhoun missed, I'll leave and you'll never hear from me again." Elias looked at Gideon. Gideon's expression was unreadable. 10 minutes, Elias said. Raven was worse than she'd expected. The stallion stood in the back corner of his stall with his head hung nearly to the ground, his flanks wet with sweat, his breathing labored and too fast. He was a magnificent animal. Even in this state, even with his coat dulled by fever and his eyes glazed, you could see what he was. You could see why someone had named him Raven. He did not flinch when Vivian entered the stall. That worried her more than anything else. A horse with enough fight left in him will react to a stranger. This horse just stood there. She moved slowly. She put her case down near the door, which meant getting within his reach before she retrieved anything from it, which was a calculated risk. She approached him from the left, talking low and steady. Not soothing words exactly, just the sound of a human voice behaving normally in proximity to something frightened. "All right," she said quietly. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm just going to look." She ran her hands over his neck first. Fever. Significant, but not the highest she'd felt. His pulse was elevated. His gums were pale, drier than they should be. She checked his eyes, his breathing pattern, the set of his muscles. Then she started working methodically along his body, pressing gently, watching for the specific kind of flinch that wasn't pain avoidance, but localized response. Elias stood at the stall door. She was aware of him watching, but she didn't let it change what she was doing. Gideon had not followed them to the stable. She found it on the left side, behind the shoulder, at the edge of the thick winter coat that hadn't fully shed. A spot that would be easy to miss if you were doing a standard examination and not pressing deep enough. A spot that was hot to the touch in a way that was different from the general fever heat. Concentrated, specific. She pressed. Raven made a sound she hadn't heard him make before. Not a cry. Something more restrained, like he was trying not to show it. "I need my case," she said. She retrieved it, opened it, and took out what she needed. She was aware of Elias moving closer. She was aware of the quality of the silence changing. "What is it?" he asked. "There's an abscess," she said. "Deep one, behind the shoulder blade. It's been there for a while, weeks maybe. It's why the fever won't break. His body is fighting it, but it's too deep for him to clear on his own." Silence. "Calhoun didn't find it," Elias said. It wasn't a question. "It's easy to miss," she said, which was true. She didn't add that it was also easy to find if you pressed hard enough and in the right places, which was also true. "Can you do something about it?" Elias asked. Vivian looked at the horse. She looked at the abscess site. She calculated what she'd need and what she had and what the realistic chances were if she did everything right and the horse cooperated and nothing went wrong that she wasn't expecting. "Yes," she said, "but it's going to take time. I'll need to drain it and treat the wound and manage the fever through the night. This isn't a 1-hour fix." Elias was quiet for a moment. "How long?" "Until morning, maybe longer depending on how he responds." "And if it doesn't work?" She looked at him directly. "Then you're no worse off than you are right now." He studied her face. She did not look away. "All right," he said. "What do you need?" She worked. That was the simplest way to describe the next several hours. She worked and the ranch worked around her. Supper was cooked and eaten in the main house. The hands came back from whatever they'd been doing. The evening settled into darkness. And Vivian stayed in the stall and worked. She drained the abscess carefully, which was difficult and which Raven did not enjoy, though he bore it with the patient suffering of an animal that had run out of energy to resist. She cleaned the wound and packed it and began the process of getting fluids into him, which required patience and repetition and the kind of focus that made everything outside the stall, the sounds of the ranch, the wind picking up, the distant talk of the hands, disappear entirely. A young hand came to the stall door sometime around 9 o'clock. He was maybe 17, with a face that hadn't finished deciding what it was going to look like, and he stood there for a minute watching her before he spoke. "You need anything?" he asked. "Water," she said. "Clean water, 2 buckets, and if there's a lamp you're not using, I could use more light." He went and got them. He came back not just with the lamp and the water, but with a tin plate covered with a cloth. He set it on the ground near the stall door without saying anything. "What's that?" she asked. "Cook made extra," he said. He shrugged, like it embarrassed him to have done something considerate. "Figured you hadn't eaten." She hadn't. She realized that now. "Thank you," she said. "Name's Nate," he said. "Vivian." He nodded. He seemed like he wanted to say something else. "You really think you can help him?" She looked at Raven, who was standing a little less like he was about to fall over, which was something. "I think so," she said. "I think there's a reasonable chance." Calhoun said he was done. "Calhoun might have been having a bad day," Vivian said. "It happens to everybody." Nate almost smiled. "Gideon says you're wasting Mr. Boone's time." She kept her voice neutral. "What do you think?" The boy considered this seriously, the way some people his age still could. "I think Raven's still standing," he said. "That's more than he was doing this morning." "Then we're ahead," she said. Nate stayed, not in the way, just nearby, sitting on an overturned bucket outside the stall, quiet enough that she mostly forgot he was there, which was the right way to help someone who was working. You didn't crowd them, you didn't ask questions, you just stayed close enough that they weren't alone. Midnight came and went. Raven's fever hadn't broken, but it hadn't climbed either. Vivian monitored his temperature every hour, adjusted what she was doing based on what she found, and talked to him in the low voice she used when she was concentrating. Not narrating exactly, more like thinking out loud. "You're not done," she told him. "I know you feel like you're done, but you're not." He didn't respond to this, obviously. He was a horse. But somewhere around 2 in the morning, he shifted his weight, a small thing, almost nothing, and put his nose against her arm. Not asking for anything, just making contact. Vivian held very still. She had learned from her father that you did not anthropomorphize what you saw in animal behavior. You did not project emotions onto creatures who experienced the world in ways you could not fully understand. You watched, you observed, you responded to what was actually there. But she had also learned, in 9 years of watching her father work and 3 years of working on her own, that horses knew things. They could feel the difference between a person who was afraid of them and a person who wasn't. They could tell somehow when the hands on them were trying to help. She put her hand against his neck. "Hang on," she said quietly. Around 3 in the morning, Gideon Price came to the stable. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps that stopped just outside the door, a pause, then came inside. He stopped outside the stall. He looked at Raven, then at her, with an expression that was difficult to parse. "You're still here," he said. "I said I'd stay until morning." "Most people say things," Gideon said. She looked up at him. In the lamplight, his face was harder to read than it had been in daylight. "Most people," she agreed. "What can I do for you, Mr. Price?" He was quiet for a moment, just checking on the horse. "He's stable," she said. "Fever's holding. Wound looks clean. I'm cautiously hopeful." He nodded slowly. He looked at Raven again, and for just a moment something crossed his face that she couldn't identify. Not concern for the horse. Something else. Calculation, maybe. She would think about that look later. "Boone's going to ask you to leave in the morning," Gideon said. "We'll see," she said. "He doesn't keep strangers on. Especially—" "I know," she said. "Thank you for the warning." He left. Vivian watched the empty doorway for a moment, then she turned back to Raven. The sky outside the stable door was just beginning to separate from gray to something lighter when Raven raised his head. Not the weak, effortful lift of a sick animal trying to orient itself. A real raise, alert, ears forward, eyes less glazed than they'd been all night. Vivian was half asleep against the stall wall. She came awake fast, the way people do when they've trained themselves to sleep light. She sat up. She looked at the horse. Raven looked back at her. She took his temperature. The fever had broken. Not dramatically. It wasn't the kind of thing that announced itself with any fanfare. The number was simply lower than it had been, measurably lower, enough lower that it meant something. "There you are," she said. She offered him water. He sniffed the bucket, then drank. Slowly, not with any enthusiasm, but he drank on his own. Nate woke up from where he'd fallen asleep on the bucket outside the stall. He looked at Raven, looked at Vivian, and understood without being told. He went to get Elias. Elias came to the stable before he'd been awake long enough to have coffee. He was still buttoning his shirt when he came through the stable door, and he stopped when he saw the horse. Raven was standing at the front of the stall. He was watching the door the way horses watch things when they're paying attention again. Elias was quiet for a long time. "His fever broke," Vivian said from where she was cleaning up her instruments. "A couple hours ago. He's drinking. I'll need to change the wound dressing twice a day for the next 10 days and keep watching for secondary infection. But I think he's going to be all right." Elias walked slowly to the stall door. Raven put his nose over the gate and pressed it against Elias's chest. The rancher stood there with his hand on the stallion's face and didn't say anything for a while. Vivian kept her attention on her instruments. Some moments didn't need to be watched. "What do I owe you?" Elias said finally. Vivian straightened. She looked at him, this difficult man with his guarded face and his hand still resting on his horse's neck. She had thought about what she was going to say when this moment came. She had thought about it during the long hours of the night when thinking was the only thing that kept the tiredness from taking over. She had considered asking for payment, which she needed. She had considered asking for a reference, which she also needed. She had considered the practical and reasonable options. And then she had decided, "I want a chance to work," she said. "A real one. Not a single call, not a favor. A trial. Let me work your horses for 6 weeks and see what I can do." Elias looked at her. The guardedness in his face didn't disappear, but something shifted behind it. "I've got a foreman," he said. "I know. I'm not asking to replace your foreman. I'm asking to take care of your horses." Gideon manages the horses. Gideon manages a lot of things, Vivian said carefully. Your horses need someone whose only job is the horses. Silence. Outside, the morning sounds of the ranch were beginning. Boots on wooden steps, someone calling across the yard, the particular creak of a gate swinging open. 6 weeks, Elias said. 6 weeks. You don't work out, you're gone. No argument. Agreed. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded once and walked out of the stable. Vivian leaned against the stall wall and let out a slow breath. Raven turned his head and pressed his enormous nose against her shoulder. She was so tired she could have slept standing up like the horse beside her. Her hands ached. Her back was a conversation she didn't want to have. She smelled like antiseptic and horse sweat and the particular staleness of a night spent awake indoors. She didn't care. She had been given a chance. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew yet, was that Gideon Price had been in the stable the night before for a reason that had nothing to do with checking on Raven. What she didn't know was that the abscess had been there for 6 weeks. Not because it had been missed, but because certain things had been done in the dark to make sure it stayed hidden until it was too late. What she didn't know was that she had just walked into something much larger than a sick horse, and that the man who had done it was already watching her from across the yard, working out what to do about the fact that she was still here. Vivian slept 3 hours on a cot that Nate dragged into the tack room without being asked, and when she woke up, the sun was already high and her back felt like someone had spent the night folding her in the wrong direction. She lay still for a moment, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the sounds of the ranch, Boots' voices, the distant complaint of a gate hinge that needed oil. Then she got up, washed her face with water from the bucket near the door, and went to check on Raven. He was eating. Not enthusiastically and not much, but he had his nose in the hay and he was pulling at it with the slow, deliberate focus of an animal that had decided it might want to stay alive after all. Vivian stood at the stall door and watched him for a long moment. In all the years she'd been doing this work, first alongside her father, then alone, in ranch after ranch across 2 territories, she had never fully gotten used to the particular quality of relief that came with watching something survive that wasn't supposed to. She changed his wound dressing. He tolerated it better than the night before, which was a good sign. She took his temperature, noted it in the small journal she kept in her vest pocket, and refilled his water bucket. Nate appeared at the stable door while she was finishing up. "Cook's got coffee," he said, "and biscuits if you're quick. The hands eat them fast. I'll be there in a minute." She wasn't quick enough for the biscuits. But there was coffee, thick and dark, the way it got when it had been sitting since before dawn, and she drank it standing at the edge of the cook shack's porch while the ranch hands moved around her with the particular indifference of men who had decided she was either going to prove herself or not, and didn't see much point in forming an opinion before that happened. One of them did not share that indifference. Gideon Price sat at the end of the long table inside the cook shack, and though he didn't look at her directly, she was aware of him the way you're aware of weather coming in from the west. Not seeing it yet, but feeling the shift in the air. She drank her coffee and didn't look back. Elias came out of the main house mid-morning and found her in the corral with a roan mare that had been favoring her right rear leg. Vivian was crouched in the dirt with the mare's hoof in her lap, working a small pick along the edge of the shoe. He stopped at the fence rail and watched for a moment. "I didn't ask you to do that." "No," she agreed, "but she's been compensating for 3 days from the look of her stride, and if you leave it another week, she'll start throwing the other hip out, trying to balance." She freed a small stone from the groove near the frog, showed it to him briefly, then set the hoof down. Nothing serious, but it would have been. Elias leaned on the rail. He looked at the mare, then at Vivian. "The trial starts today," he said, "not yesterday." "Understood. Meaning I'm not counting last night toward the 6 weeks." She stood up and brushed the dirt from her knees. "That's fair. And I need to be clear about something." His voice didn't change in tone or volume, but there was something in it now that hadn't been there before. Not unfriendly, but direct. The way a man is direct when he's spent too long dealing with indirect things. "You report to me, not to Gideon, not around Gideon, to me. If you find something wrong with an animal, you come to me first." Vivian looked at him. "Is there a reason you're telling me that?" "I'm telling you how the ranch runs." "All right," she said. He nodded once and left. She stood in the corral with the roan mare blowing softly against her shoulder and thought about the particular way Elias had said Gideon's name, like it was a word he was careful with, like a stone he set down deliberately rather than dropped. She thought about Gideon standing in the stable at 3 a.m, watching her work. She went back to work herself. The first week of the trial was harder than the second, not because the work was difficult, but because she was being watched. Not openly. No one stood in her way or challenged her directly, but she felt it in the quality of the silences around her. The way conversation stopped when she walked into the stable. The way Gideon's two regular hands, a man named Cole and another one they called Burl, always seemed to be occupied with something in the same area of the barn she was working in. She kept her records from the first day. It was something her father had instilled in her early. You kept records not because you expected to need them, but because the day you needed them and didn't have them was the day it mattered most. She noted each animal, each treatment, each observation, temperature, appetite, gait, coat condition, any behavioral changes. She noted the dates. That was when she started to see the pattern. It took her 4 days of going back through what records existed before she was certain. The Double B kept a livestock ledger, treatments administered, feed purchases, farrier visits, and it was incomplete in the particular way records got incomplete when someone had been maintaining them carelessly for a long time. But there was enough there, enough gaps, enough dates that didn't line up. 3 horses in the last 8 months, all of them sick in ways that were hard to diagnose quickly. All of them had experienced prolonged illness that didn't respond to standard treatment. One of them had died. The other 2 had recovered slowly, over weeks after Calhoun's initial treatment failed and was repeated. Vivian sat in the tack room with the ledger open on her knee and thought about what she knew about infections that hid themselves, about fevers that kept returning, about wounds that didn't close properly, about the kind of damage that looked like bad luck unless you were specifically looking for the other possibility. She didn't say anything yet. She wasn't certain, and certainty mattered before you said something that couldn't be unsaid. But she watched Gideon more carefully after that. He was good at his job. She had to give him that. He managed the hands efficiently, coordinated the workday, kept the ranch operating with the smooth competence of someone who had been doing it for a long time and had it all mapped in his head. He was not cruel to the animals, at least not visibly. He did not do anything in the time she was watching him that she could point to directly. But there were things, small things. He checked Raven's stall more often than made sense. Not every day, but frequently enough that she started noting the times. She noted that he always did it alone. She noted that after his visits, Raven seemed sometimes slightly more agitated than before, though not enough that anyone who wasn't paying close attention would notice. She paid close attention. On the 9th day of her trial, a man rode into the Double B that Vivian had not seen before. He came in the late afternoon and went directly to the main house, and Elias met him on the porch and they talked for a while with the kind of body language that means the conversation is not going well. The man left before supper. She asked Nate about it that evening while they were checking on the horses together. Who was the man that came this afternoon? Nate hesitated. He had the particular hesitation of someone who knows something and isn't sure if sharing it is wise. Lawyer, he said finally, from the territory office. What does a territory lawyer want with the Double B? Nate glanced toward the main house. There's a woman, he said. Mrs. Whitlock, Margaret Whitlock. She owns the cattle operation about 12 miles east of here. She's been claiming for about 6 months that some of Mr. Boone's southern pasture actually belongs to her. Says the original survey was wrong. Is it wrong? Everybody around here thinks the survey's fine. The land's been Boone's for over 20 years. He shrugged. But she's got money, and she's got lawyers, and she keeps pushing. Vivian thought about that. What does she want with the southern pasture specifically? Water, Nate said simply. There's a spring on it. Only reliable water source for 3 miles in any direction. Her land runs dry in summer. She needs that water for her cattle. Vivian was quiet for a moment. And Gideon? She said carefully. How long has he worked here? Nate looked at her. He was 17 and not stupid. He understood that the question wasn't casual. 12 years, he said. Before Mrs. Boone died. Before all of it. And does he know Mrs. Whitlock? A longer pause this time. I don't know, Nate said. But the way he said it meant that he had wondered. Vivian nodded and changed the subject and didn't bring it up again that night. She needed to know more before she said anything to anyone. And she needed to know it from observation rather than speculation. Speculation was how you got people in trouble they didn't deserve. She had seen that happen too. The trigger came on the 12th day. She was in the far corner of the stable, checking on a young gelding that had been off his feed, when she heard voices from the other side of the partition wall. She had not announced herself when she came in. She had gone in through the side door that came off the equipment yard, because the main stable doors had been stiff all morning and she hadn't wanted to fight them. She recognized Gideon's voice first. Needs more time. She's asking questions. A second voice, one she didn't recognize. Male, careful, the vowels slightly more clipped than the local way of speaking. Someone from somewhere else. Mrs. Whitlock doesn't have more time, the second voice said. The territory office sent a surveyor. He's coming at the end of the month. I know when the surveyor's coming. Then you know that if Boone has his paperwork in order before that, he won't, Gideon said. I've made sure the right things are missing. Vivian stopped breathing. She pressed herself against the partition wall and did not move. And the woman? The second voice asked. A pause. She's a problem, Gideon said. She's looking at the ledgers. She's keeping her own records. I don't know how much she's worked out. Can you get her gone? I'm working on it. Vivian stood in the corner of the stable with her hand pressed flat against the wood partition and the young gelding nosing at her arm in polite confusion, and she thought very fast and very clearly. She waited until she heard footsteps, 2 sets moving away toward the main stable doors. She gave it a full minute, counting slowly in her head. Then she moved. She went to the tack room. She opened her father's veterinary case, which she kept locked with a small padlock that she wore the key to around her wrist, and she took out the ledger copies she'd made in the past 12 days. She had been copying the relevant pages in the evenings by lamplight in the tack room with the door closed, partly because her father had taught her to keep copies of records and partly because something had felt wrong here from the first day and she had learned to trust that feeling even when she couldn't name it yet. She put the copies at the bottom of the case, beneath her instruments. Then she went out to find Raven's stall and change his wound dressing, because if Gideon or his friend happened to come back through, she needed to look like she had been doing exactly that for the past half hour. Raven had improved enough in the past 10 days that he tolerated the dressing changes without being restrained. He stood with his chin resting on her shoulder while she worked, which she found both touching and slightly inconvenient, since it made it harder to reach the site of the wound. I know, she murmured. I'm working on it. Move your head. He moved his head approximately 2 inches and then put it back. She finished the dressing and stood with her hand on his neck for a moment, thinking about what she'd heard and what it meant and what she was going to do about it. She needed to tell Elias. The problem was she needed to tell Elias without telling him in a way that could be easily dismissed or complicated by the fact that she had no proof beyond what she'd heard through a partition wall, and a foreman of 12 years standing was going to carry more weight with a rancher than a woman who had been there for 12 days. She knew that. She had run into that specific wall enough times in enough places to know its dimensions by feel. She needed to be careful. She needed to be smart, and she needed to find out what paperwork was missing. That afternoon, she went to Elias and told him she needed to review the ranch's land records to cross-reference dates against the livestock ledger she'd been working from. She framed it as being about the horses. About identifying whether any of the illness patterns corresponded to changes in the horses' grazing locations, which was not entirely untrue. Elias looked at her for a moment. Why the land records, he said. Because if animals were being moved to different pastures at specific times and getting sick after, that's a pattern worth knowing about. He considered this. He was a man who weighed things before he answered, which she had come to appreciate. The land files are in the office, he said. Back cabinet, left side. I'll tell you where the key is. The office was a small room off the main house's back hallway. A desk, a bookcase, 2 filing cabinets, and the smell of tobacco and old paper. Vivian went through the back cabinet methodically. She knew roughly what she was looking for. The original survey documents that established the Double B's southern boundary, the deeds, any correspondence relating to the water rights on the spring parcel. She found the deeds. They were intact. She found correspondence, several years of it, relating to the ordinary business of the ranch. She found the original territorial land grant, creased and yellowed, with Elias Boone's name and the date 22 years back. What she did not find was the original survey map. The survey map that would have definitively established the boundary of the southern pasture. The document that, in any territorial dispute about the accuracy of the current survey, would be the primary piece of evidence Elias needed. She looked through the cabinet twice. She checked the other cabinet. She checked the desk drawers. It was gone. She stood in the middle of the small office and thought about Gideon's voice through the partition wall. I've made sure the right things are missing. She went back to Raven's stall and sat on the bucket that Nate had started leaving there as if it were naturally her bucket now. And she thought about what she was going to do. She could go to Elias tonight, tell him what she'd heard, tell him the survey map was gone, and let him deal with it. That was the straightforward approach. The problem was that Gideon had 12 years of trust behind him, and she had 12 days, and she knew from experience how that arithmetic worked. Elias might believe her. He might not. And if he didn't, and if Gideon found out she'd gone to Elias, she would be gone from the ranch before morning, and whatever was happening here would continue without anyone watching it. She thought about Nate, who had carried her lamp and her water and a tin plate of food without being asked, and who had stayed all night on an overturned bucket because he didn't want her to be alone. She thought about what happened to places like this ranch when the wrong person got their hands on the water supply. She went to Elias that evening, not with what she'd heard, not yet, with a question. She found him on the front porch as the light was going down, and she sat in the second chair without being invited to, which she knew was presumptuous and did it anyway. The original survey map, she said. The one establishing your southern boundary. Where would that normally be kept? He looked at her sideways. Back cabinet, land files. It's not there. He was quiet. Then, what do you mean it's not there? I mean, I went through that cabinet twice, and it isn't there. Neither is the survey correspondence from the year you filed the original land claim. She paused. When did you last look at those files? I don't look at them, he said. No reason to. They're established. They were established, she said. He sat very still. She could see him working through it. The implication, the timing, the connection to the territorial lawyer who had ridden out here 9 days ago. Gideon manages the office, Elias said slowly. I know, Vivian said. Another silence, a longer one. You're saying something, he said. Say it plainly. She did. Not everything. Not what she'd heard through the partition wall. Not the full shape of what she'd worked out, because she was still not certain enough and she was too careful to overreach. But she told him the documents were missing, and she told him that the timing and the territorial survey coming at the end of the month, the ongoing land dispute, the missing paperwork, was not a coincidence she was comfortable explaining any other way. She told him she thought he needed to know. Elias sat on his porch for a long time after she finished, looking out at the dark shape of his land in the failing light. 12 years, he said finally. Not to her, to the dark. I know, she said. He's been with me since before... He stopped. She waited. Since before my wife died, he finished. He was there for all of it. Vivian did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. Betrayal that came from long trust was its own kind of injury, and it didn't need commentary. I need proof, Elias said. I'm not... He stopped again. I won't go at him without proof. I understand. Can you get it? She looked at him. The question was direct in the way she had come to understand Elias Boone was direct. He was asking her to do something dangerous, and he was asking it without dressing it up as anything else. I'm working on it, she said. She went back to the stable. She checked on Raven. He was doing well enough now that in another week he might be able to go into the small paddock for short periods, which was the next stage of his recovery. His coat was starting to come back. His eyes were clear. She sat with him in the late quiet of the stable and went through her notes, looking for the thing she'd been building toward without quite knowing it. The pattern in the ledger dates, the timing of the illnesses, the gaps in the records that corresponded when she lined them up with the moments when the land dispute had escalated. She had almost everything she needed. What she needed now was something she hadn't gotten yet. She needed to know where the missing documents had gone, because missing didn't mean destroyed. Documents like that, useful documents, the kind that could be used as leverage or simply kept out of the way until the right moment. Those didn't get burned. They got moved. She was thinking about where a man like Gideon would move something like that when she heard the sound. It came from outside, a sharp creak, like a fence post taking weight, followed by nothing. She stayed still and listened. The horses around her were quiet, which was a better indicator than her own ears. Then she heard it again, closer. She put her hand over the lamp, not extinguishing it, but reducing the light, and moved to the stable wall where she could see through the gap in the boards to the yard beyond. Gideon was walking slowly along the back fence line with a lamp of his own, low, shielded. He was moving toward the small equipment shed at the far end of the yard, the one that stored tools in winter and hadn't been opened much since the weather turned. Vivian watched him until he reached the shed and went inside. She gave him 3 minutes. Then she pulled on her coat and went out through the side door. The equipment shed was padlocked, but the padlock was on the inside, which meant Gideon had a key. She stood outside the door in the dark and listened. She could hear him moving around inside, the scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor. She was not going to be able to go in there tonight. Not without him knowing she'd been there. But she knew now where he went, and she knew what he'd been doing there, and she had enough to make a reasonable case about where the missing documents might be. She went back to the stable. She took out her journal and wrote down the time and what she'd seen, exactly as she'd seen it, without interpretation. Then she put the journal away, checked Raven one last time, and lay down on the cot in the tack room. She did not sleep for a long time. She was thinking about timing. about the territorial surveyor coming at the end of the month, about what Gideon and Margaret Whitlock needed to happen before then. And she was thinking about something Nate had said to her on the first night, when she was exhausted and uncertain and halfway to convincing herself she'd made a mistake coming here. "I think Raven's still standing. That's more than he was doing this morning," she had told him. Then we're ahead. She was still ahead, but the margin was thinning and she could feel it. What she didn't know yet, what would change everything in the next 48 hours, was that Gideon had seen her lamp through the stable wall. He had seen it go dim and then bright again, and he had understood what that meant. And when he came out of the equipment shed and looked toward the stable and saw the side door not quite fully closed, he understood that too. He stood in the dark yard for a moment, looking at that door. Then he walked to the main house, knocked on the window of the room where his contact was staying, and told him they needed to move faster than planned. Inside the stable, Raven shifted in his stall, restless in a way he hadn't been all evening. Vivian, half asleep on her cot, heard it. She lay still, listening to the sounds of the ranch around her, and the back of her neck felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the night air. Something was coming. She just didn't know yet what shape it was going to take. She was up before dawn, not because she'd slept well. She hadn't, but because the cold feeling at the back of her neck had not gone away, and lying on the cot waiting for something to happen felt worse than getting up and doing something about it. She washed her face, checked on Raven, noted his temperature in her journal, and was standing at the stable door watching the sky go from black to the particular dark blue that came just before color when she made her decision. She was going into that equipment shed, not with Gideon there, in daylight, with him occupied elsewhere, when she could look without being caught looking. She needed to know if the documents were there, and she needed to be able to tell Elias with something more than a theory built on lamplight and instinct. The opportunity came mid-morning. A fence line on the north pasture had come down overnight. Not dramatically, just a section of posts that had been leaning for a season finally giving up. And Gideon took Cole and Burl and two of the other hands out to repair it. It was the kind of job that would take most of the morning. Vivian watched them ride out, then waited another 10 minutes to be certain, then crossed the yard to the equipment shed. The padlock on the outside hasp was closed, but it was an old lock, the kind her father had kept in a box of miscellaneous hardware because the key was lost and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it. She had spent one rainy afternoon when she was 12 years old learning to open every lock in that box with a bent piece of wire because her father believed that practical knowledge was never wasted. She had not thought about that afternoon in years. It took her 4 minutes. The shed was dim and smelled of oil and old wood and something else beneath it, a sharper smell. Mineral and faintly chemical that she identified after a moment as the specific kind of preservative used on important papers to keep them from moisture damage. It was a smell she knew from her father's files. She moved carefully through the shed. Tools along one wall, a broken plow frame, stacked feed sacks that had been empty long enough to go stiff. In the back corner, half hidden behind a section of rolled fence wire, she found what she was looking for. It was a tin box, the kind used for keeping documents dry, with a simple clasp rather than a lock. She opened it. The original survey map was on top, folded, creased at the folds, but intact and legible. Beneath it, the survey correspondence, 4 letters exchanged between Elias and the Territorial Land Office 20 years ago, establishing the boundary of the southern pasture and the water rights attached to it. Beneath that, a document she hadn't expected, a letter, handwritten, on stationery she recognized after a moment as the letterhead of the Whitlock Cattle Company. She read it. It was dated 3 months ago. It was addressed to Gideon Price by name. It outlined, in the careful language of a person who understood that what she was proposing was not legal, a payment arrangement, a significant one, in exchange for ensuring that Elias Boone could not produce his land documentation before the territorial survey. It referenced a second payment contingent on the successful transfer of the southern pasture boundary. Margaret Whitlock had signed it herself. Vivian stood in the equipment shed for a moment, holding the letter, and felt the particular weight of having found the thing you were looking for and wishing briefly that you hadn't found it yet, because finding it meant the next part started now, whether you were ready or not. She took the letter, she took the survey map, and the correspondence. She left the tin box where it was with the remaining papers inside, because taking everything would tell Gideon immediately that someone had been in here, and she needed a little more time before that happened. She went back to the stable, unlocked her father's veterinary case, and put the documents beneath her instruments. Then she locked the case and settled the key back on her wrist. She checked on Raven. He was good. Better than good, actually. He had started moving around his stall with something approaching his old energy, and when she came to the gate, he pressed forward to greet her with a pushiness that made her smile despite everything. "You're getting better," she told him. He bumped her hand with his nose, looking for something she didn't have. She gave him the stub of a carrot she'd had in her pocket since breakfast. "Don't tell anyone," she said. "It'll ruin my professional reputation." She needed to get the documents to Elias without Gideon knowing before she was ready. She thought about that through the noon hour while she made her rounds of the other horses and noted her observations and did the ordinary work of the day. She had learned from her father that the best way to move carefully was to keep moving normally, that people notice stillness more than they notice motion, that someone who changed their routine stood out far more than someone who simply went about their business. So she went about her business. She was treating a quarter crack in one of the bay gelding's hooves when she heard the sound of horses coming into the yard. Not Gideon's party returning from the fence line, but a different sound, more horses than that, and the specific jingle of formal tack rather than working gear. She set the gelding's hoof down and looked out through the stable door. 3 horses and a buggy. The buggy was well kept, black lacquered, with a matched pair of grays pulling it, and the woman who stepped down from it when it stopped in the yard was dressed in the way of someone who wanted to make certain you understood she had money before she said anything else. Margaret Whitlock was somewhere in her mid-50s, broad-shouldered, with silver hair worn up and a face that had once been handsome and now was simply formidable. She had 2 men behind her, not ranch hands from the look of them. Men who stood slightly back and slightly too still, the way men stand when their job is to be available rather than to work. And behind the buggy, riding separately on a gray horse that matched the buggy team, was a man in a suit with a leather satchel across his body, a lawyer. Vivian did not move from the stable doorway. She watched. Elias came out onto the front porch. He had clearly not been expecting this, and his face showed it. Not panic, but the particular controlled stillness of a man who was recalibrating in real time. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. His voice carried across the yard, flat, polite, the way you are polite to someone you'd rather not be polite to. "Mr. Boone." Margaret Whitlock's voice was the kind of voice that had spent years in rooms where it expected to be listened to. "I apologize for the unannounced visit. My attorney has some papers he'd like to discuss with you." "Your attorney always has papers," Elias said. "That's generally what attorneys are for." She smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who knew she was holding better cards than the person across the table. "May we come inside?" Elias looked at the lawyer, at the 2 men standing behind Margaret, at the buggy. He looked briefly at the stable where Vivian was standing. She wasn't sure if he saw her. "I'll hear what he has to say on the porch," Elias said. The lawyer, a narrow man with the kind of posture that came from spending too many years hunched over documents, came up the porch steps and opened his satchel. He produced a set of papers and held them out. "We filed a formal boundary challenge with the Territorial Land Office," he said. "Given the upcoming survey at month's end, we've also filed a petition requesting the court suspend any transfer or use of the disputed southern parcel until the survey is completed and reviewed." "The southern parcel is not in dispute," Elias said. He did not take the papers. "That's precisely what the survey will determine," the lawyer said pleasantly. "I have documentation establishing my boundary." "We'd be very interested to review that documentation," Margaret said from the yard. "In fact, if you'd care to share it now, we could—" "My documentation is my business until I choose to share it," Elias said. The lawyer lowered the papers slightly. "Mr. Boone, I want to be straightforward with you. The petition has already been filed. Whether you produce documentation or not, the survey will proceed. And if the survey finds what our research suggests it will find—" "Your research is wrong," Elias said. "Then you have nothing to worry about." Another pleasant smile. "We'll show ourselves out. Please review the petition at your convenience." He set the papers on the porch railing and walked back down the steps. Margaret Whitlock looked at Elias for a moment. Something in her expression was less formidable than it had been a minute ago. Not quite uncertainty, but the awareness that the conversation had not gone exactly as planned. "I've always admired what you've built here, Elias," she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name. It would be a shame to lose part of it over a line on an old map. "I agree," Elias said. "That's why I'm keeping the line where it is." She held his gaze for another moment, then turned and got back into the buggy. Vivian watched the buggy and its outriders go back through the gate and down the road toward town. Then she looked at Elias, still standing on the porch with the filed petition in his hand. She walked across the yard. He looked up when he heard her coming. "You saw that?" "Yes." "The survey map," he said. "I need it." "I know." She kept her voice low. "Come to the stable." He followed her. She unlocked her father's case and took out the survey map, the correspondence, and the letter. She laid them on the stable workbench. He looked at them in order. He was very still while he read, The way a person is still when what they're reading requires all of their attention. He read the letter twice. When he looked up, his face had changed. Not in any dramatic way. Elias Boone was not a man whose face did dramatic things, but there was something behind his eyes that had not been there before. Something that looked less like anger and more like the particular exhaustion that comes from betrayal by someone you trusted enough to stop watching. 12 years, he said again. The same words he'd used on the porch 2 nights ago, in the dark. I'm sorry, Vivian said. He didn't respond to that. He looked at the letter again. This is enough, he said. For the territorial office. This is more than enough. Yes, but I need you to know, Gideon doesn't know I have the letter. He knows I was near the shed last night. He may suspect something. If he realizes the letter is gone before you can get it to the right people, he won't get the chance, Elias said. His voice had gone very quiet, quieter than she'd heard it before. It was the voice of a man who had made a decision and was now simply executing it. Where is he? Elias said. North fence. He's been out there since this morning. Elias folded the letter carefully. He put the survey documents inside his jacket. I'm going to ride to town this afternoon and file these with the land office before the close of business. I want you to stay with the horses. All of them. Don't let Gideon near Raven's stall when he comes back. And if he asks why? Elias looked at her. Tell him I said so. He went to saddle his own horse. Vivian stayed in the stable and tried to feel relieved, but couldn't quite get there. She kept thinking about the way Gideon had looked at her through the stable wall that first night. The calculation in it. The fact that a man who had been careful for 12 years was not going to stop. Being careful simply because things had started to go wrong. She was thinking about that when Nate came in through the side door, moving fast, with the specific look on his face of someone who has seen something they need to report. Gideon's back, he said. Him and Cole and Burl. They came in the back way through the south paddock. I don't know why they came in that way. The fence on the north... They didn't go to the north fence, Vivian said. What? She was already moving. Find Mr. Boone. He's at the main barn saddling up. Tell him Gideon is back. Tell him now. Nate went at a run. Vivian locked her father's case, checked that the documents were gone, Elias had taken them, they were safe, and went to stand at Raven's stall gate. The stallion was calm. She put her hand on his neck and kept it there and watched the stable door. Gideon came in 2 minutes later. He did not look surprised to see her, which told her something. He looked at her, and then at her locked case, and then at her hand on Raven's stall gate, and the calculation she had seen in him before was working visibly behind his eyes now, less hidden than it used to be. Hartley, he said. Price, she said. You've been in the equipment shed. It wasn't a question, so she didn't treat it like one. You've been coming in through the south paddock, she said. The north fence must have fixed itself. He stopped in the middle of the stable. He was about 8 feet from her. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she tried not to be aware of things like that, because it didn't help. Whatever you think you found, Gideon said, it's not what you think it is. I found what was in the tin box in the equipment shed, she said. Some of it's still there, if you want to check. Something moved in his face. Not quite fear. More like the moment when a man realizes the game he's been playing has changed and he hasn't fully caught up to the new rules yet. You don't know what you've walked into, he said. I know exactly what I've walked into, she said. The question is whether you know what you've walked out of. I took a step toward her. Elias came through the stable door. He had not finished saddling his horse. He had come the moment Nate found him, and he was still carrying the saddle blanket in one hand, and his face had the quality of a sky just before a storm. Not the storm itself, but the particular stillness that preceded it. Gideon stopped. The 3 of them stood in the stable in a silence that had weight to it. Outside, somewhere across the yard, Cole and Burl were doing something. She could hear movement, but they were outside, and this was inside, and what was happening in here was between these 3 people. Elias, Gideon said. His voice had changed. The foreman's authority had drained out of it, and what was underneath was something older and more uncertain. Whatever she told you, she didn't tell me anything I didn't already see with my own eyes, Elias said. He reached into his jacket and took out the letter. He held it up. Your handwriting is on the envelope, Gideon. Even if you didn't write the letter, you addressed it. You kept it. Gideon looked at the letter and did not say anything. 12 years, Elias said. His voice was still quiet, still that particular quietness. 12 years you've been on this land. You were at my wife's funeral. You were here when I almost lost everything the winter of... He stopped. And you sold it. For what? For what she was paying you? You don't understand the position I was in, Gideon said. Then explain it. She came to me 2 years ago. His voice had taken on the flat affect of a man reciting something he'd gone over many times in his own head. She said the land had always been hers by rights, that your grandfather had cheated her father in the original survey. She said she was going to get it back one way or another, and that it would go easier for everyone if someone on the inside helped things along. And you believe that? I believed she was going to do it regardless, and I thought... He stopped. I thought if I helped manage it, I could make sure it didn't... He stopped again. Make sure it didn't what? Elias said. Make sure it didn't cost you anything? Gideon said nothing. The horses, Vivian said. Her voice came out flat and steady, which was what she wanted. The 3 horses that got sick, the ones before Raven. You did that deliberately. Gideon looked at her. For a moment, she thought he was going to deny it. Margaret needed the ranch to look like it was struggling, he said instead, like you couldn't manage it, like it would be better off under different management. She needed the territorial office to think. You nearly killed Raven, Elias said. He wasn't supposed to get that bad. I lost track of... You nearly killed my horse. Elias's voice had not risen. That was somehow worse than if it had. The horse my wife picked out. The horse she named. You nearly killed him for a payment arrangement. Gideon looked at the floor. Vivian exhaled slowly. She became aware that she had been gripping the stall gate hard enough that the wood had left a mark across her palm. She let go. I want him off this land, Elias said. Today, this hour. He looked at Gideon. You take what's yours and you go. I won't go to the territorial office about your part in this. Not today, because I need to focus on getting my documentation filed before that surveyor comes. But if I find out you've said a single word to Margaret Whitlock about what happened here this afternoon, or if you do anything to interfere with what I'm filing, I will hand that letter to the territorial marshal and let him sort out what it means. Do you understand me? Gideon looked up. He had aged somehow in the past 10 minutes. Or maybe she was just seeing him differently now. I understand, he said. Then go. Gideon went. Vivian stood at Raven's stall and listened to his footsteps cross the yard, and then the sound of his bunkhouse door, and then silence. Elias was standing in the middle of the stable with the saddle blanket still in his hand, looking at nothing in particular. I need to get to town, he said finally. Yes, she said. Go. I'll stay here. He looked at her. Something in his expression was different from any way he'd looked at her before. Not softer exactly, but less defended. Like something had been removed that he hadn't known was there. Thank you, he said. Just that. He went to finish saddling his horse. Nate appeared at the side door, looking like he wasn't sure whether it was safe to come in yet. Vivian waved him over. Is it? He started. It's handled, she said. For now. She looked at the boy's face. The relief in it, the question in it, the particular mix of things you felt at 17 when the adults around you turned out to be fallible in ways you'd suspected, but hadn't wanted to confirm. He's gone. Gideon's leaving. Nate was quiet for a moment. He was here for 12 years, he said. Not defending Gideon, just acknowledging the fact of it. I know, she said. What happens now? She looked at Raven, who was watching both of them with his ears forward, alert to the change in the air of the stable the way horses always were alert to things that changed, without understanding exactly what had changed. Mr. Boone goes to the land office, she said, files his documentation. The survey happens at the end of the month and the boundary gets confirmed. She paused. And then we see. And Mrs. Whitlock? Mrs. Whitlock has a signed letter with her name on it proposing something that is not legal, Vivian said. I expect she'll think very carefully before she pushes any further. Nate considered this. And you? He said. What happens to you? She hadn't thought about that part yet. Not specifically, not with the full attention it probably deserved. She had been thinking about the next hour, the next problem, the way she always had. She had not been thinking about what came after the immediate fire was out. I have 3.5 weeks left on my trial, she said. He almost smiled. You think he'd send you away after all this? I think he said, 6 weeks and I'm going to finish the 6 weeks, she said. I'm not a person who stops before the job is done. Nate nodded, like this was both completely expected and also somehow exactly right. The rest of the afternoon moved strangely. The flat, slightly unreal quality that came after a crisis when the adrenaline had burned off, but the body hadn't gotten the message yet. Cole and Burl, when they realized Gideon was gone, moved through the yard with the careful unsurprisedness of men who had suspected things for a while and were relieved to have the suspicion resolved. Neither of them said much to her. But Cole, passing the stable door late in the afternoon, stopped long enough to nod at her once in a way that meant more than a nod usually meant. She nodded back. Gideon was gone by the time the sun reached the tops of the western peaks. She did not watch him leave. She was checking on a paint mare in the far stall who had been showing early signs of a hoof condition that, caught now, was straightforward to treat. She was making her notes. She was doing her work. She was almost done with her notes when the wind changed. She noticed it first as a sound, a low frequency she felt more than heard, the kind of pressure change that preceded weather. She went to the stable door and looked at the sky to the northwest. The clouds were the color of an old bruise, moving fast from the mountains toward the valley. The light had gone strange and flat. "Nate," she called. He came out of the feed room where he'd been working. "Get the horses that are in the paddocks inside," she said. "Now, all of them. Don't wait for anyone to tell you it's needed." He looked at the sky and went without asking why. She went to help him. They got 7 horses in before the first crack of lightning split the air somewhere north of the ranch. The sound hit a moment later, the physical percussion of it rolling down through the mountains, and several of the horses still in the paddocks threw their heads and scrambled toward the fence. Vivian moved through them, talking low and steady, the same voice she used in stalls, the same voice she'd used with Raven on the first night. Calm was contagious in the same direction that panic was contagious, and she knew this and used it, getting a rope on each animal and moving them toward the stable door with deliberate, unhurried purpose. The rain came sideways. She was soaked through before she got the 6th horse inside. Her boots were full of water. There was mud to the ankle in the paddock, and the ground was still moving water in channels that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. She was going for the 7th, a gray mare that had pressed herself into the far corner of the paddock, when Nate shouted from somewhere behind her. She couldn't make out the words over the rain. She got the mare and brought her in and latched the stable doors and turned to find Nate standing at the back of the stable with his lamp up, his face pale under his tan. "The south fence," he said. "Something's wrong with the south fence." She pushed wet hair off her face. "Wrong how?" "It's down," he said. "Cole just came from there. He said it looks like it was cut." She felt the cold at the back of her neck again, the same cold from last night. "How many horses were in the south pasture?" she said. 8, Nate said. "And Raven." She looked at Raven's stall. It was empty. She had not brought Raven in because he had only been in the paddock for 3 days, small, supervised sessions, the beginning of his recovery exercise. And today she had not put him out because of the footing after last night's rain, and she had assumed he was still in his stall, and she had not checked because she had been moving horses and the rain had come fast, and she had not checked. She was already moving. "Who's got a horse ready?" she said. "Cole's still saddled," Nate said, moving with her toward the door. "Tell him I need his horse, and get a rope. Get several ropes." She stopped at the door and turned back. "Nate, the south pasture goes up into the mountain trail?" "The east edge. Yes." She thought about 8 horses and a recovering stallion loose in the mountain trails in this rain and the dark that was coming faster than the rain. She thought about the cuts. She thought about timing and about a man who had been told he was leaving today and had not tried to argue or bargain, had simply gone. She pushed through the stable door into the storm. Cole's horse was a big buckskin named Drum, steady-tempered and sure-footed, which was what she needed more than speed right now. Vivian got up into the saddle without ceremony and took the ropes. Nate shoved into her hands and pushed Drum through the gate before she'd fully sorted out what she was carrying. The rain hit her like a wall the moment she cleared the ranch yard. It had the weight and direction of something personal, driving in from the northwest with the kind of force that bent the grass flat and turned the visible world into a gray smear of water and wind. She kept her head down and her eyes up, which was a contradiction but the only workable one, watching the ground for the worst of the mud while keeping enough peripheral vision to navigate toward the south pasture. The cut fence was obvious even in the rain. The wire had been pulled from 3 posts in a clean section about 8 feet wide. Not storm damage, not age. Clean cuts, low on the wire. The kind you made with good pliers and a clear intention. She looked at it for 2 seconds and rode through the gap. The south pasture was empty. The horses had scattered fast, which was what horses did in storms. They moved, they didn't bunch, they followed whatever instinct said to get away from the thing that was frightening them. 8 horses plus Raven, loose in 40 acres of pasture that backed up against the mountain trail on its east side. She found the first one within 10 minutes. A bay gelding standing at the far corner of the pasture with his head down and his ears back, miserable and confused but not panicked. She got a rope on him and tied him loosely to a fence post that was still standing. A temporary thing, not ideal, but she couldn't take him back to the ranch and go out again fast enough. She needed to find the others first and figure out who was where. The second and third were together near the creek bed, which had turned from a trickle to a moving problem in the time since the rain started. She got ropes on both of them, tied them together, and left them with the first. The lightning was closer now. Each crack came with a delay that was getting shorter, which meant the storm center was moving over them rather than across. The horses she'd found were getting harder to hold. She kept her voice going, not loud, just present, and worked fast. She found 4 more in the next 20 minutes, scattered across the upper section of the pasture, moving in the aimless, frustrated circles horses made when they were frightened and couldn't find a direction that felt safe. She gathered them the way her father had taught her, approaching from the side rather than the front, keeping herself between the horse and the open ground, using the fence line when there was fence to use. 8 horses. Raven was not among them. She counted again because she was tired and wet and the numbers had to be right. 8 horses tied or grouped near the cut fence, heads down, waiting. Raven was not here. She looked at the east edge of the pasture where the ground started to rise and the scrub thickened into the beginning of the mountain trail. The trail went up into the canyon country above Silver Creek. Rocky, narrow in places, with the kind of terrain that was difficult in good weather and genuinely dangerous in a storm. She rode east. The pasture fence gave way to open ground, and then the ground started rising and the vegetation closed in and Drum's footing changed under her. Firmer here, away from the low areas where the rain was pooling, but uneven, rocky, the kind of ground where a horse needed to pick its way rather than move fast. She gave Drum his head and let him find his own pace. She was calling Raven's name, which she understood was probably not useful. He was a horse, not a dog, but she did it anyway because it gave her something to do with her voice, and because the sound of her own voice in the dark and rain was better than the alternative, which was silence and the particular loneliness of being the only person on a mountain trail in a storm looking for a horse that might have gone anywhere. She found his tracks in a section of mud between 2 rock outcroppings heading up and east. Recent, the rain hadn't filled them yet. She followed them. The trail narrowed as it climbed. Drum moved carefully, placing each hoof with the deliberate attention of an animal that understood the ground was not to be trusted. The lightning, when it came, gave her brief white seconds of total visibility. Enough to see the trail ahead, the rocks on either side, the dark shapes of scrub oak and juniper bent nearly flat by the wind. In one of those white seconds, she saw him. Raven was 30 yards ahead on the trail, standing at what looked like a wider spot. He was not moving, which was wrong. A frightened horse moved. A horse that had stopped moving either had somewhere it couldn't go or something it couldn't do. She urged Drum forward, carefully. The trail was getting worse here. The rock surface she could feel through Drum's gait was slick with rain, and the edge of the trail on the right side had a quality to it she didn't like, a lack of solidity, an absence of the sound her horse's hooves should have been making. She stopped Drum and got down. It was easier on foot here, or at least more honest. On foot, your own body told you what the ground was doing rather than having to read it through an animal's reaction. She moved toward Raven with the rope in her hand, keeping to the left side of the trail where the rock was most solid under her boots. When she got close enough, she saw why he'd stopped. The trail ended, or rather, it didn't end, but it changed dramatically and badly. The section of trail ahead had given way. Not tonight, from the storm, but recently. Maybe a week ago, maybe 2. A section of the outer edge had calved off the cliff face and left a gap of about 6 feet where the trail had been. On the other side of the gap, the trail continued. Raven had gone as far as he could go and hit the break in the path and stopped. His front legs were on solid rock. His hind legs were on the section of trail that was still there, but not, she understood immediately, entirely reliable. The rain was coming off the cliff face above them in sheets, and the ground at the inner edge of the trail was softening, and what had been a manageable section of broken trail in dry weather was something else right now. She stood very still for a moment and looked at the situation clearly, the way her father had taught her to look at bad situations. See it as it is, not as you wish it were. If he stepped backward, he might make it. The section of trail behind him was more solid. But a spooked horse moving backward on a wet mountain trail in the dark was not a controlled thing. If he stepped forward, he would go into the gap. 6 feet of nothing, and then the cliff face dropping away into the dark. If he stood still and the ground under his hind legs continued to deteriorate, the decision would be made for him. She had 3 ropes. She had no one else. She had Drum tied back around the bend of the trail, which was far enough that she couldn't use him for leverage without leaving Raven unattended, which she was not willing to do. She moved to Raven's left side and put her hand on his neck. He was trembling. Not the fine shiver of cold, but the deep, muscular tremor of an animal that has been frightened long past the point where its body can process the fear cleanly. He turned his head toward her when he felt her hand and pressed his nose against her arm with a pressure that was too hard, urgent, the way animals were urgent when they had run out of other options. "All right," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. "I'm here. I see it. We're going to work it out." She was talking to herself as much as to the horse. She knew that. She clipped one rope to his halter. She ran the other end back along the trail to a juniper that looked rooted deeply enough into the rock to matter and tied it off. Not tight, just a guide. Not something that would hold him if he went, but something that might slow a stumble into something survivable. Then she went back to his head. The ground under his hind legs shifted. Not much. A small thing, a settling. But Raven felt it, and his whole body went rigid in the way horses went rigid just before they bolted, the massive muscles gathering for an explosion that on this trail would be catastrophic. "Hey," she said. Sharp. Not loud because loud was wrong here, but sharp. A single syllable that cut through the noise of the rain, the way a specific sound sometimes cut through everything else. "Hey, look at me." He looked at her. She knew that wasn't quite the right way to describe what a horse did, but he oriented toward her. Ears, eyes, the turn of his head, and the gathering in his muscles paused. She kept her eyes on him and didn't look down. "You know me," she said. "You know my hands. You've had my hands on you for 3 weeks. You know I'm not going to do anything that hurts you." She moved her hands slowly from his neck to the flat of his face, the way she'd done in his stall at 2 a.m. when he'd pressed his nose against her arm. "I need you to trust me for about 30 seconds. That's all." 30 seconds, and then we're going back down the mountain. The ground shifted again. She made the decision. She had been thinking about it since she saw the trail, the forward possibility and the backward one. And she had been thinking about the engineering of it the way her father had taught her to think about animal movement. Which direction does the body want to go? Which direction gives it the most support? Which direction uses the momentum rather than fighting it? Going backward asked Raven to use his hind legs in a complicated way on ground that was failing. It asked him to push against his own instinct, which was to put his weight forward on the more solid front section. Going forward asked something that looked impossible but wasn't, quite, if she did it right. The gap was 6 feet. The trail on the other side was solid. The jump was not far. Not for a horse, not even a horse that had been ill and was still in recovery, not if he was moving and committed and didn't have time to think about it. The problem was getting him committed, getting him moving, getting him to a place where the jump was just the next thing that happened rather than a thing he'd been given time to be afraid of. She unclipped the guide rope from his halter. She coiled it. She kept one hand on his neck and turned to face the same direction he was facing the gap, the dark, the far side of the trail. And she felt him feel that shift in her, the way horses felt when the person beside them changed their orientation. She clicked her tongue once, the sound her father had used, the sound that meant forward. Raven's ears went forward. She clicked again and stepped, pulling him with her, not by the rope, but by the contact between her hand and his neck, the forward lean of her body, the language of movement. He took one step. The ground under his hind legs gave a sound like a breath releasing. She pulled forward and clicked a 3rd time and said, "Come on," in the particular low, urgent voice she used when she needed an animal to make a decision and make it now, and Raven lurched forward, and she moved with him, and she felt the moment of total suspension, both of them in the air, or something close to it, the gap opening and then closing, and then the solid rock of the other side under his hooves. And she was scrambling sideways on the trail to get out from under 800 pounds of landing horse, and her boots went out from under her, and she went down hard on her right side on the wet rock. She lay there for a second. Raven stood on the far side of the gap, all 4 legs on solid trail, breathing in the rough way horses breathed after something frightening. She sat up. She checked her right hand, scraped, bleeding a little from the palm where the rock had taken skin. Her hip would bruise. She had bitten the inside of her cheek when she went down, and the copper taste of blood sat at the back of her throat. She got up. "Good," she told Raven. Her voice came out rough, and she didn't care. "You did good." She looked back at the gap. The section of trail she'd been standing on was still there, but she could see now, with the clarity that came after something was done, that it wouldn't be there long. The inner edge was undermining. A week, maybe less. She needed to get back across. She looked at it differently from this side. The gap was the same 6 feet, but the angles were different. and the approach was better from this direction, and she had momentum that she hadn't had before. She backed up 3 steps, ran, and cleared it with a foot to spare on each side. She stood on the stable side of the gap and breathed for a moment. Then she got the rope on Raven. He stood still for it, too tired and too relieved to be particular, and began walking him back down the mountain. It took 40 minutes to get down the trail in the rain. She didn't try to go fast. Drum was where she'd left him, tied and unhappy about it, and she led both horses through the scrub and back into the south pasture. The other 8 were still where she'd left them, several of them having worked themselves loose, but none having gone far. She was getting the second group together and moving them toward the cut fence when she heard hoofbeats coming from the direction of the ranch. 2 riders. One of them was Elias. She knew him by the way he sat the horse, not because she'd been watching him that long, but because some people you recognize at distance for reasons you couldn't fully articulate. He came through the cut fence and across the wet grass and pulled up when he saw her, soaked, holding ropes attached to 3 horses standing in the middle of the storm-wrecked pasture. He looked at her, and he looked at Raven behind her, and he did not say anything for a moment. The second rider was Cole, who immediately went to work on the loose horses without being told. "You found him," Elias said. "He'd gone up the east trail," she said. "There's a break in the path about halfway up. He got stuck." "A break? He jumped it," she said. "He's fine. His legs are fine. I checked." Elias looked at Raven, who was standing behind Vivian with the dazed patience of a horse that had had enough adventure for one evening. Then he looked at Vivian. She could feel what she must look like, soaked through, mud from the knee down, blood dried on her right hand, hair plastered to the side of her face. She had lost her hat somewhere on the mountain. "You went up a mountain trail," Elias said, "in this storm, alone." "Someone had to," she said. "You could have waited." "For what? For him to go over the edge while we were waiting?" He looked at her for a long moment. The rain was still coming, steadier now than it had been, which was somehow worse than the earlier violence of it, the storm settling in for the long work. His face was doing the thing it did when he was working through something he didn't know how to say directly. "How's your hand?" he said finally. She looked down at it. "Fine. Scraped. Come here." She went to where he was on horseback and held up her hand, and he looked at it with the lamp he'd brought, which was mostly a useless exercise since the rain was doing what it was doing and the lamp was fighting a losing battle. But he looked. "You need that cleaned," he said. "I know. When we're back." He nodded. He didn't let go of her wrist right away. His thumb was over the pulse point, which she thought was probably accidental and didn't say anything about. "He cut the fence," Elias said. "Gideon." "I know." "I didn't..." He stopped. "I sent him off the property. I should have made sure he actually left the territory." "You couldn't have known he'd do it on the way out," she said. "I should have anticipated it." "Elias." She said his name for the first time without the formal prefix, which she registered but didn't stop. "You filed the documents. The land office has the survey map and the letter. Whatever he does from here, the evidence is already where it needs to be. He can't take that back." He finally let go of her wrist. "No," he said. "He can't." Cole had gathered the last of the loose horses and was moving them toward the cut fence with the efficient, unhurried purpose of a man who had been doing this long enough to be calm about it. Vivian led Raven and the 2 she was holding, and Elias rode alongside, and they brought all 9 horses back through the gap and across the pasture in the rain. The ranch yard, when they came back through the main gate, had the particular organized chaos of a crisis being managed. Nate had gotten 2 other hands to help, and the stable doors were open and lit, and there were people moving in the purposeful way people moved when someone capable had given them things to do, and they were doing them. Nate came to take Raven's lead rope from her. He looked at her hand, and then at her face, and then at Raven, with the thoroughness of someone making sure all the important things were still accounted for. "He okay?" he said. "He will be," she said. "I want to check his legs properly when he's inside and dried off. I'll get the lamp." She checked Raven's legs, all 4, methodically, the way she did everything, while he stood in his clean, dry stall and ate with a focus that suggested the mountain had been mostly inconvenient rather than traumatic. She found no new injuries. The wound site from the original infection was unchanged. She noted his temperature, which was within normal range. She closed her journal and sat down on the bucket that was her bucket now and held her scraped hand against her thigh and let herself be still for the first time in 3 hours. Elias appeared at the stall door. He had a clean cloth and a bottle of something she recognized as carbolic solution. He held them out. She looked at him. "Sit," he said. Not an order. The other version of it. She sat. He crouched in front of her and cleaned the scrape on her palm with the specific care of a man who was not accustomed to this kind of tending and was doing it seriously because of that. It stung. She did not flinch, which took a small amount of work. "The fence," he said while he was working. "I'll have it repaired tomorrow. I'll have the whole south section checked." "Good. And I'm going to have someone ride to the territorial marshal's office in the morning with a copy of the letter." He paused. "I thought about what you said, about not filing charges. But what he did tonight, the horses could have been killed. You could have been—" "I know," she said. "I should have done it this afternoon." "Yes," she said. "Probably." He looked up. She thought he might be expecting her to soften that. She didn't. "You're not wrong," he said. "I know," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, not that, but something adjacent to it, something that recognized the exchange for what it was. Two people who said what they meant. He finished wrapping her hand with a strip of the clean cloth, tied it off neatly, and stayed where he was for a moment, still crouched in front of her, close enough that she could see the rain still beaded on his jacket, the exhaustion around his eyes that matched what she felt in her own body. "When I came through that fence and saw you in the middle of the pasture," he said, "standing there in the rain with a bunch of horses and ropes." He stopped. "It's my job," she said. "No," he said, "it's not." He looked at her. A trial hire doesn't ride up a mountain trail alone in a storm to find someone's horse. That's— He stopped again, and she had the impression that he was a man who did not run out of words often and was finding it disorienting. "I would have done it for any horse on this ranch," she said. "I know that," he said. "That's what I mean." She looked at him. The lamplight in the stable was the same light there had been on the first night 3 weeks ago, when she'd been sitting in this same stall doing the same essential work and he'd stood at the gate and watched Raven drink water for the first time. The same light and a different version of both of them, she thought. Same people, but with the particular modification that happened when people went through things together and came out the other side. "Get some rest," he said. He straightened up, and the moment of nearness resolved back into the ordinary space between two people. "I mean it. The horses are fine. Nate and Cole are on watch tonight. Go sleep." "I'll check on Raven at midnight," she said. "I know you will," he said. He sounded resigned to it in a way that wasn't really resignation at all. "I'll bring coffee." He left. She sat with Raven for a while after that, not doing anything in particular, just being there. The stallion had finished his evening meal and was standing at the back of his stall in the half-doze horses fell into when they were comfortable. One hip dropped, eyes soft. She thought about the trail, about the gap, about the second she'd spent looking at it from Raven's side and deciding what had to happen next. Her father used to say that the worst decisions were never the ones you made with time to think. The worst ones were the ones where the ground was giving way while you were deciding, and you had to choose with what you knew right now and nothing else. She had made the right call. She believed that. But she also knew, sitting here in the dry warmth of the stable while the rain continued outside, that the right call and the safe call were not always the same call, and the distance between them on a mountain trail in the dark was exactly 6 feet of empty air. She was still thinking about this when she heard boots in the yard. Not Elias. His were a sound she knew now, a slightly heavier fall on the right side from an old injury she'd noticed in his gait without asking about. These were lighter, quicker. Nate appeared at the stable door. He was dry, which meant he'd been inside for a while. He looked at her with the particular expression he had when he was about to report something he wasn't sure she'd want to hear. "Cole found something," he said, "out by the cut fence, when he went to tie it closed for the night." She stood up. "What?" "Tracks," Nate said. "And a camp. Fresh. Someone's been watching the ranch." She stood very still. "From which direction?" she said. "East," he said. "Up in the rocks above the south pasture. You can see the whole ranch from up there." She thought about Margaret Whitlock, who had ridden out here today with a lawyer and a petition and a smile that knew more than it was saying. She thought about Gideon, who had cut the fence on his way out, and then, had he gone? Had he actually left, or had he gone as far as the rocks above the south pasture and set up a camp and watched the chaos he'd created? She thought about the fact that the documents were filed now in the Territorial Land Office, but that filing documents and having them matter were two different things, and the distance between them could still be traveled in the wrong direction by the wrong people if they moved fast enough. "Tell Elias," she said. "Cole already did," Nate said. "He wants to know what you think." She looked at Raven, still dozing in his stall, unaware of any of it. "I think," she said slowly, "that whoever's up in those rocks is watching to see what happens next." She looked at Nate. So we need to make sure what happens next is not what they're counting on. Elias sent Cole and 2 other hands up into the rocks before first light, not to confront whoever was up there. Elias was not a man who sent people toward unknown situations in the dark without knowing what they were walking into, but to watch, to document, to come back with information rather than a problem that had gotten larger. Vivian stayed in the stable. She had slept 3 hours on the cot, which was 2 more than she'd managed the first night and somehow felt like less. Her hand ached where the rock had taken the skin, and her hip had settled into the deep bruise she'd predicted for herself on the mountain trail, and she moved through the morning rounds with the specific care of someone who was hurting in ways that they've decided not to prioritize. Raven was good, better than good. He ate his full morning portion and stood at the front of his stall watching the yard with alert interest, like a horse who had remembered he was supposed to care about things. She checked his wound site. It was closing cleanly. She noted it in her journal and felt something she was careful not to call pride, because pride led to complacency, but it was close to pride. Cole came back at 7 in the morning. He found Elias and Vivian in the yard together. Elias had brought coffee, as promised, and they had been standing in a silence that was not uncomfortable, watching the light come up over the east peaks. 2 men, Cole said. Camp looks like 2, maybe 3 nights' use. They're gone. Cleared out sometime in the night. He held out what he'd found. A piece of paper, folded once, left weighted under a rock at the edge of the camp. Found this. Elias unfolded it. Vivian read it over his arm without asking permission. It was short. 3 lines, in the careful handwriting of someone dictating legal language from memory. The claim has been withdrawn. Further correspondence will come through proper channels. Consider this matter closed. No signature, no date. Elias read it twice. He refolded it and held it for a moment, looking at the eastern peaks where Cole had come from. Margaret, he said. Not a question. Has to be, Cole said. That's her way of doing things. No face, no admission, just a note under a rock. Vivian thought about the letter with Margaret Whitlock's signature on it, the one that was now in the Territorial Land Office alongside Elias's survey documentation. She thought about a woman who was intelligent enough to build a cattle empire and ruthless enough to run a 12-year foreman against a neighbor's ranch, now calculating the odds on her remaining options. The letter changed everything. Margaret had signed it herself, not through an intermediary, not through the careful buffer of someone else's handwriting. Her name was on an explicit proposal to commit land fraud, and it was currently sitting in a government office with people who had the authority to act on it. Pressing the land claim further meant drawing more attention to that letter. Withdrawing quietly meant cutting her losses before the territorial marshal came looking. She had chosen to cut her losses. Vivian took a slow sip of coffee. She'll be more careful next time, she said, with whoever she targets next. Maybe, Elias said, or maybe the territorial office follows up on the letter and she doesn't get it next time. He looked at Cole. Thank you. Go get breakfast. Cole went. Elias stood in the yard with the folded note in his hand and the coffee getting cold and the morning light doing what morning light did over New Mexico. Coming in slowly at first and then all at once, filling everything. It's over, Vivian said. Mostly, he said. The marshal still wants to talk to Gideon. They'll find him eventually. They will, she agreed. He looked at her sideways. You don't seem surprised about any of it. I'm surprised it resolved this fast, she said honestly. I expected her to push harder. She's a practical woman, he said. That's always been her trouble, actually. She's practical enough to know when a position is untenable, not moral enough to have avoided getting into it. He paused. There's a type. Vivian thought about the ranchers who had turned her away before Silver Creek, the ones who had looked at her case and her hands and her face and made their calculations and sent her on. She thought about practicality as its own kind of cruelty. Not vicious, just indifferent, which was sometimes worse. There is, she said. They stood there a little longer. Nate came out of the bunkhouse and crossed the yard and stopped when he saw them and clearly decided this was not the moment to report whatever he'd come to report. He reversed course without saying anything. Vivian almost smiled. Your 6 weeks are up in 9 days, Elias said. She had been aware of that. She was always aware of that kind of deadline, the way you were aware of a tooth that had started to ache. Not constantly, not obsessively, but present underneath everything else. I know, she said. I want to offer you something. He stopped. He was a man who said things precisely and took his time getting to precision. She waited. Not a job, he said. Not the way I'd offer a job to a hand or even a foreman. That's not... He stopped again. I want to offer you a formal arrangement, a partnership in the livestock operation. Your name attached to the work you're doing with a share of what it produces, equal standing." She looked at him. "I've been thinking about this since before the storm," he said. "Since before Gideon, since before any of it." He held her gaze with the directness she had come to understand was simply how he was. Not performing confidence, just using it. "You came here to save a horse. You ended up saving considerably more than that. And I've been watching you work for 3 weeks and I know what I'm looking at. I've been in this business long enough to know what I'm looking at." "You've known me for 3 weeks," she said. "I know. I'm aware of how that sounds." "It sounds fast," she said. "It is fast," he said. "I'm not pretending it isn't, but I've also been running this ranch alone for 6 years, and I know what it looks like when something is working and what it looks like when something is missing." He paused. "Both things are true at once. I'm not confused about that." She looked out at the yard, the stable, the paddocks, the particular quality of this land in the morning light. She thought about what she had when she arrived. $14 in her boot and a worn case and a reputation she hadn't made yet. She thought about what belonging felt like, and how long it had been since she'd felt it, and how she'd told herself for a long time that she didn't need it, which was the kind of thing you told yourself when you'd stopped believing it was available. "I need a week to think," she said. "All right," he said. No argument, no pressure. He took her at her word the way she'd noticed he took most things, at face value, without maneuvering. "And I'm finishing the 6 weeks regardless," she said. "Whatever I decide, I don't leave jobs unfinished." "I didn't think you did," he said. He went inside. She finished her coffee and went back to work. The 9 days were different from the days before them, though she would have been hard-pressed to say exactly how. The work was the same, the routine was the same, but something in the atmosphere of the ranch had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone would have put into words, but present the way pressure changes before a storm or releases after one. Word had gotten around Silver Creek about Gideon. Small towns moved information the way water moved through dry ground, fast and everywhere, and you couldn't quite trace the specific path it took. By the 3rd day, people in town knew that Gideon Price had been removed from the Double B under circumstances that involved Margaret Whitlock and a letter and some missing documents. The specific details were imprecise, as they always were by the time they reached the 3rd retelling, but the essential shape was right. Doc Calhoun came to the ranch on the 5th day. Vivian was in the small paddock with Raven. Real exercise now, 20 minutes of controlled movement, nothing that would strain the wound site, when she saw Calhoun's horse tied at the front fence. She finished the session and led Raven back to his stall before she went to find out what the old veterinarian wanted. He was on the porch with Elias when she came around the side of the house. He looked at her with the same slow blink he'd used when she walked into his office 3.5 weeks ago, but there was something different in it now. "Hartley," he said. "Calhoun," she said. "Heard you've been busy." "Somewhat." He looked at Elias, then back at her. "Raven's genuinely recovered? Ask him to the fence and see for yourself," she said. Calhoun looked at her for a moment. He was a man who made decisions slowly and kept them once he'd made them, and she could see him making one now. "I've got 3 ranch clients asking about you," he said. "Since the word got out, they want to know if you're available for calls." She said nothing, waiting. "I'm not getting younger," Calhoun said. He said it flatly, without self-pity, the way a man stated a fact he'd already made his peace with. "I've been looking for someone to take the large animal work for 2 years. Couldn't find anybody worth the trouble." He paused. "I'm not saying you're worth the trouble yet. I'm saying you might be, and I'd rather find out on purpose than let you get poached by someone in the next county." Vivian looked at him. "Are you offering me a working arrangement?" "I'm offering you access to my client list for large animal calls in exchange for a percentage of the fee. You'd work independently. I'm not trying to hire you. I'm too old to manage someone." He said this like it was a compliment, and she took it as one. "I'd want to be consulted on complicated cases, not because I don't think you can handle them, because 2 people thinking is better than 1. "Agreed," she said. He blinked. "That's it? No negotiation?" "The percentage is fair if it's 20, she said. "Is it 20? "It's 20. "Then there's nothing to negotiate," she said. He almost smiled. It had the quality of something he didn't do often. "I'll leave the list at the office. Come by when you're ready." He stood up from the porch chair with the effort of a man whose joints had been through winters. "Nice work on the horse," he said. He said it the way a surgeon might acknowledge a clean incision. Technically, without excess. Coming from Calhoun, it was close to effusive. He left. Elias watched him go. He's been practicing that speech, he said. The man doesn't do anything he hasn't thought through first. Neither do I, she said. He looked at her. The 8 days were almost up. I've thought about it, she said. Your offer. He waited. I'll take it, she said. The partnership. But I want it in writing, and I want it specific. What my role covers, what decisions I make independently, what we decide together. I've shaken hands on arrangements before, and shaking hands is fine until something goes wrong. Agreed, he said immediately. And I'll be taking calls for Calhoun's client list on the days when the ranch doesn't need me. I won't let it interfere with the horses here, but I'm not going to pretend I don't have skills that other people need. I'd be a fool to ask you to, he said. You'd be surprised how many people would ask me to, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I probably wouldn't, he said. She looked at him, this difficult, careful man who had watched her work for 3 weeks and then offered her something real, without conditions, without the usual architecture of doubt that people built around women doing this work in this territory and this time. She thought about what it cost him probably to make that offer. Not the practical cost, but the internal one. 6 years alone. The habit of alone. She understood that habit. She had been building it in herself since Denver, adding to it with each ranch that turned her away, each town that looked at her case and her face and her hands and decided before she'd opened her mouth. The written agreement, she said. Can we do it this week? Tomorrow, if you want, he said. I'll have the lawyer come out. Not the same lawyer who came with Margaret Whitlock. He looked at her. Obviously not. She almost laughed. She didn't, quite, but it was close, and he saw it, and his face did the thing it did. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one, the acknowledgement of something shared. The territorial survey happened on the 28th day. The surveyor came out from the land office with 2 assistants and a set of instruments and spent most of the day on the southern boundary. Vivian watched from a distance, not because she was anxious. The documentation was solid, she had no doubt about that, but because she had been part of getting it there and she wanted to see it through to its end. The surveyor confirmed Elias's boundary line. The spring was on Double B land. The water rights were intact. He filed his report the same afternoon and rode back to town. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no confrontation, no last-minute maneuver from Margaret Whitlock. Whatever calculations Margaret had been running since the withdrawal note had led her to a conclusion that did not involve further engagement, at least not now. The territorial marshal's office found Gideon Price 11 days later, in a town 2 counties east, staying in a boarding house under his own name, which suggested he had either underestimated the reach of the investigation or had simply run out of the energy required to be more careful. Howe was brought back to Silver Creek for a formal inquiry. The proceedings were slow and complicated in the way territorial legal proceedings always were, and they stretched over several months. Vivian was called to give a statement about what she had found in the equipment shed and what she had overheard through the stable wall, and she gave it plainly and in detail, and the examiner wrote it down and asked his questions, and she answered those too. She never saw Gideon during the proceedings. She did not look for him. She had said what she knew, accurately, and what happened next with that information was for other people to determine. She had done her part. Margaret Whitlock was summoned for a separate inquiry regarding the letter. Her attorney was present. The outcome was not dramatic. There were fines, there were conditions, there was a formal record that her name was attached to. She did not lose her ranch, she did not go to prison. The territory's legal machinery was slow and imperfect and not designed to land hard on wealthy people who could afford good attorneys. Vivian understood that. She didn't like it, but she understood it. Justice in the practical world was not the clean thing you hoped for when you were young and still believed in clean things. It was partial and slow, and sometimes it only went as far as making sure the same thing couldn't happen again in quite the same way. She had protected Elias's land. That was real. That had happened. She held on to that. The written partnership agreement was signed on a Tuesday morning in Elias's office, with his lawyer present and 2 witnesses, Cole and Nate, who had been asked and had both said yes without hesitation, though Nate had also asked if he could be excused from reading the whole document because legal language made his eyes cross, which Elias told him was fine, and Vivian told him he should probably grow out of that. It was a real document. Her name was on it. Her role was specific. Management of all livestock health on the Double B, independent authority over veterinary decisions, shared authority over horse acquisition and sale, a percentage of the returns from the horse operation that reflected real partnership and not token inclusion. She signed it, and it was done. That afternoon, she rode out to the south pasture and looked at the repaired fence line and the spring beyond it, which was running clear and quiet in the late autumn light. The mountains were getting their first snow on the high peaks. Not enough to worry about yet, but a reminder that this land had its own schedule and its own requirements and would not be argued with. She sat on the repaired fence rail and thought about what her father had said about belonging. He had not said it in the way people said it in books, with the architecture of wisdom and the polish of hindsight. He had said it tired, at the end of a long day, sitting at their kitchen table in Denver with his coat still on, because he was too worn out to take it off. The trick, he had said, is not to find a place that's already made for you. Nobody makes places in advance. You find a place that has the right materials, and then you build it yourself, and afterward it feels like it was always there. She had been 16 when he said that, and she had not fully understood it, and she had been carrying it around for 15 years without always knowing what she was carrying or why. She understood it now. She got off the fence and rode back. Raven made his first full run in the last week of November. It was a morning with the particular clarity of cold, dry air, everything sharp and defined, the kind of morning where you could see the detail of things at distance. She had been letting him build up gradually. The paddock sessions first, then the small pasture, then longer stretches of controlled trot in the big pasture. This morning, she opened the big pasture gate and stepped back and gave him nothing. No direction, no guidance, no request. He stood at the gate for a moment. He looked at the open pasture and the long space of it and the particular quality of a November morning that invited speed. He went, not cautiously, not with the uncertain testing of a horse still measuring its own recovery. He went as if he had been waiting for exactly this, as if the weeks of gradual return had been tolerated rather than appreciated, and now the real thing was here and he had no further use for patience. He ran the length of the big pasture and turned at the far fence without slowing and came back. His coat was dark in the cold air and his movement was exactly what it had been before, that quality she had noticed even when he was sick, what he would be when he was well. He was that now. She stood at the gate and watched him and did not try to describe what she felt, because some things you didn't need to put into words. Elias came to stand beside her without announcing himself, which was something she had gotten used to, his way of appearing without the precursor of sound. He must have come from the direction of the barn. They watched Raven run. His stride looks normal, Elias said after a while. Better than normal, she said. He's compensated for the muscle loss on the wound side. You can see it in the way he's carrying the left shoulder. Elias looked. I can't see that, he said. You will, she said. After a while, you start seeing things in the way horses move that you couldn't see before. It's like learning a language, slow at first, and then all at once you understand whole sentences. He was quiet for a moment, watching the stallion run. Is that what it was like for you, learning this work? Some of it, she said. My father taught me from the time I was young, so some of it I learned so early I can't remember not knowing it. But there are things I still learn. Every animal is different. You don't run out of things to learn. That's true of land too, he said. I've been on this ground for 22 years, and this winter it'll show me something it's never shown me before. Guaranteed. She looked at him sideways. That doesn't bother you? No, he said. He seemed to mean it without effort. That's the part I'd miss if it was gone. The part where you don't know everything yet. Raven slowed to a canter and then to a trot and then came back toward the gate with the specific energy of a horse that has done what it needed to do and is now ready to be acknowledged for it. He stopped a few feet from the fence and blew loudly and looked at Vivian with enormous dark eyes. She climbed the fence rail and put her hand on his neck. He pressed into it. There's something I've been meaning to tell you, Elias said from his side of the fence. He said it in the way of a man getting around to something he'd been circling for a while. She waited. The first time I saw you, he said, when Gideon brought you across the yard, I had already decided you couldn't help him. I want you to know that. I had already decided it wasn't possible. I know, she said. You said as much. I'm not finished, he said. He paused. The thing that changed my mind wasn't anything you said. It was watching you look at the stable. He nodded toward the building. You looked at it the way people look at something when they already know what they're going to do. Before you'd been in it, before you'd seen the horse. You had already decided. He looked at her. I've only seen that look on people who know exactly what they're capable of, and who've had to fight every day to be in the room where they can use it. Vivian kept her hand on Raven's neck and looked at the mountain peaks and the snow on them and the November sky. I was terrified, she said. I know that too, he said. That's not the same as what I said. Both things can be true. She looked at him. He was watching her with the direct, unhurried attention that was simply his way, not performing anything, not managing a moment, just seeing her. Why are you telling me this now? she said. He was quiet for a moment. Because you've been here for weeks and you've saved my horse and found the evidence that saved my land and gone up a mountain in a storm and signed a legal agreement, and you still talk about yourself like you're waiting for someone to tell you that you're allowed to be here. He said it without accusation, plainly the way he said everything. I wanted to tell you, you're allowed to be here. You've been allowed to be here since the first morning, and you earned it before that. She did not say anything for a moment. She was not generally a woman who needed to be told things. She had built her competence and her independence on not needing to be told things, on doing the work and letting the work speak and not waiting for permission or acknowledgement. Her father had raised her that way, and her years on the road had reinforced it, and she had come to think of that self-sufficiency as a completed structure, something that was simply part of how she was built. But she had been carrying the weight of other people's doubt for a long time, longer than she'd fully admitted, even to herself, and there was a difference. She understood this now, standing at this fence on this particular morning, between not needing permission and not needing to hear that you belong somewhere. The first was independence. The second was loneliness that had learned to call itself strength. Thank you, she said. She said it simply, without deflecting. He nodded once. Raven shook his head and bumped her hand, impatient with being ignored. She laughed. It came out surprised, the way laughing did when you weren't expecting it, and she heard the ease in it. The real ease, not the performed ease she'd been using for years to signal she was fine when she wasn't. She heard the difference, and she thought her father would have heard the difference too, and been glad. The months that followed were not uncomplicated. The ranch work was hard, and sometimes it went wrong, and she made mistakes that she fixed and noted and tried not to repeat. There was a winter sickness that went through 3 of the horses in February, and she was in the stable for 4 days straight managing it. One of Calhoun's ranch clients turned out to be a man who wanted her to defer to his own opinions about his animals, and she told him twice that she was the veterinarian and she needed him to let her work, and when he didn't change, she told Calhoun she couldn't take his calls anymore, and Calhoun said, without particular surprise, that he understood. Nate became what she'd known he would become. Quick, careful, genuinely skilled, the kind of person who learned by paying attention rather than by being told. She taught him everything she could organize into teaching, and the rest she showed him by doing. He made mistakes. She told him clearly when he had and what the mistake was and what to do differently, and she did not make him feel bad about it beyond the correction. That was what her father had done for her. In the spring, 2 women from the town of Silver Creek came to the Double B and asked about work with the horses. They had heard the way things got heard in small towns through the specific accumulation of conversation, that the Double B was the kind of place where a woman could do real work and be taken seriously for it. One of them had experience with horses. The other was learning. Vivian hired them both. Elias raised an eyebrow. The operation is expanding, she said. We need people. We could hire experienced hands, he said. We are hiring experienced hands, she said. Clara's been working horses for 6 years, and Marie is going to be excellent. Give her a season. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had learned to recognize. The one where he was deciding whether to continue the conversation or accept that she had already made the decision and was simply informing him. He accepted. Marie was excellent by early summer. On an evening in July, when the light was the particular gold of high summer evenings in New Mexico and the air smelled of dry grass and something far off that might be rain, Vivian was sitting on the fence of the main paddock watching Raven in the last of the light. She was thinking about something Nate had asked her that morning, which was whether she'd always known she would end up somewhere like this, doing this work. She had told him she hadn't known, that for a long time she'd been too busy surviving to think about what she was surviving toward, that the answer to where you ended up was usually constructed in pieces over years, and you only understood the shape of it once you were far enough in to see it whole. Nate had nodded with the seriousness of someone who was writing things down in the back of his mind. She was still thinking about that when Elias came and sat on the fence beside her. He didn't bring coffee. It was evening, but he'd been doing the thing he'd done since November, the appearing without announcement, the sitting in silence that wasn't uncomfortable, the being there. She'd been doing it back, probably longer than she'd admitted, even to herself. Nate asked me something today, she said. What? Whether I always knew I'd end up somewhere like this. He was quiet for a moment. What did you tell him? The truth, she said, that I didn't know, that I was too busy moving to see where I was going. She looked at Raven, who was moving slowly around the paddock in the evening light, not running, just moving the way horses moved when they were content. I arrived here with $14 and one idea, which was to look at a sick horse before someone decided he was already dead. That's all I knew I was doing. And now, he said. She looked at the ranch, the The stable, the paddocks, the fence line she'd watched get repaired, the south pasture with the spring on it that was still double B land. She looked at the horses moving in the evening light and thought about the 2 women she'd hired, and Nate, and Calhoun's client list, and the agreement with her name on it in the office. She thought about her father at his kitchen table saying the trick is not to find a place that's already made for you. "Now I know what I built," she said. Elias looked at her. The evening light was doing what evening light did to faces, softening the edges, making visible the things that were there all along. "So do I," he said. It was not a grand declaration. It was not the sweeping language of people who had their feelings organized in advance. It was 2 people sitting on a fence in the July light saying the simple, true thing. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. Raven moved through the gold light of the paddock, fully recovered, fully himself. The horse that wasn't supposed to live, running on land that wasn't supposed to stay, saved by hands that weren't supposed to be capable of the saving. He ran because he could, because the ground was solid under him, and the evening was long, and he was well. Vivian watched him and understood something she would later try to explain to Nate, imperfectly, in the way that things that matter are always explained imperfectly. That what you save sometimes saves you back. Not cleanly, not immediately, not in the way you'd script it if you had the choice, but in the slow accumulation of mornings where you wake up knowing where you are and why you're there, and that the people beside you chose to be beside you and you chose them back. That's how belonging worked, in the end, not the dramatic arrival, but the daily decision to stay. She had come to Silver Creek to save a dying horse. She had stayed because staying was what the work required, and the work had turned out to be larger than a single horse, and the staying had turned out to be something she was choosing freely, and not just doing out of stubbornness, which was how she had been living for a long time and had not fully known it. Her father's case was in the tack room where it always was, cleaned and organized, the instruments her hands knew by feel. She had added to it over the months. A few new tools, a journal that was nearly full, the written record of every animal she'd treated since the first night. The case was worn at the corners. It had been everywhere she'd been. It would go everywhere she went from here, which, for the first time in a long time, did not feel like it meant away. The light faded. Raven slowed to a walk. Elias sat beside her on the fence, and the evening came down around them, and the ranch settled into its night sounds, and Vivian Hartley, who had arrived in Silver Creek with nowhere to belong, stayed where she was. She did not expect the letter. It came on a Wednesday morning in late August, tucked between a supply invoice and a notice from the Territorial Land Office confirming the final resolution of the Whitlock boundary dispute. A dry legal document that meant everything and read like nothing, the way legal documents always did. Vivian was sorting the mail on the porch when she found it, a plain envelope with her name written in handwriting she recognized immediately. It was from a woman named Ruth Carey, who ran a small horse operation outside a town called Dust Creek, 3 counties south. Vivian had spent 4 days there 2 years before Silver Creek, treating a difficult foaling case that had gone badly, and then, through a night of work that left both her and the mare exhausted, had gone right. Ruth Carey had paid her fairly and fed her well and told her when she left that she hoped things got easier. Vivian had thought about that sentence more than once since then. She sat down on the porch step and read the letter. Ruth had heard about the Double B, she had heard about Raven, about the land dispute, about the woman from Denver who had walked into Silver Creek with a veterinary case and no reputation and had built both within a season. She had heard it the way news traveled through ranch country, slowly, imprecisely, but essentially true. She wrote that she was glad. She wrote that she had told her daughter about Vivian when her daughter was 16, and asking whether there was any point in learning the skills she wanted to learn, and Ruth had said yes, there was a point, here was a name. This woman did not stop. Vivian read that sentence twice. She sat on the porch step for a while after she finished the letter, holding it, watching the yard. Nate was working with the bay gelding in the small paddock. Real work, competent work, the kind that no longer needed her watching to be right. Clara was in the stable. Marie was in the south pasture checking the fence line, which she had made her particular morning responsibility without being asked to. The ranch moved around her with the self-sustaining logic of something that had found its own rhythm. She folded the letter and put it in her vest pocket. She would write back to Ruth Carey tonight, a real letter, the kind that said more than thank you. She would tell her that the daughter should come if she wanted to come, that there was work here for someone who was learning, that the Double B had a habit of being useful to people who were trying to become what they were supposed to be. She was still thinking about what she would write when Elias came around the side of the house and stopped when he saw her sitting on the step. "You're not working," he said. Not accusatory, just noting. "I'm thinking," she said. "About?" She handed him the letter. He read it standing up, which was how he read everything. He was not a man who sat down to handle things he could handle standing. She watched his face while he read. He had a face that rewarded watching, not because it was expressive in the usual way, but because the small things in it meant large things if you understood the vocabulary. When he finished, he handed it back. "Ruth Carey," he said. "I have heard of her operation. Good horses." "She's a good woman," Vivian said. "She was kind to me when being kind wasn't easy." He sat down on the step beside her, which was something he would not have done 4 months ago, not out of formality, but because he was a man who had spent years keeping a certain careful distance from things he didn't know how to hold yet. He was learning. She had watched him learn the same way she'd watched Nate learn, with the same patience, though she had never said that to him and never would. "Her daughter should come," he said. "That's what I was going to write." "Write it today," he said, "before the week gets away from you." She looked at him. "I was going to write it tonight." "Tonight you'll be in the stable checking on that gray mare's hoof again," he said. "You've checked it every evening for a week." "It's improving," she said, "but not consistently. I want to see if—" "Vivian," she stopped. "Write the letter first," he said. "The mare will still need checking at 8 o'clock." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back with the patient steadiness of a man who had learned, slowly and with some difficulty, that caring about someone meant sometimes telling them to stop working for 10 minutes. "All right," she said. He nodded and stood up and went back around the side of the house to whatever he'd been doing before he appeared, which was how he managed most things, appearing, saying the necessary thing, disappearing back into the work of the day. She wrote the letter before lunch. Ruth Carey's daughter arrived 6 weeks later. Her name was Jo, short for Josephine, which she hated, a fact she disclosed within the first 20 minutes. And she was 19 years old, tall, wide-shouldered, with the look of someone who had been underestimated in specific and recent ways and had not fully decided what to do about it yet. Vivian recognized that look. She did not say so. She put Jo to work immediately, not with the horses, not yet, but with the records. The livestock ledger, the treatment logs, the documentation system Vivian had built from scratch in her first weeks on the Double B. She wanted to see how Jo thought before she saw how Jo worked with animals, because the thinking came first and the rest followed. Jo was good with numbers and impatient with prose, which told Vivian something. She was methodical when she believed the method mattered and careless when she didn't, which told her something else. She asked questions at the wrong moments and then asked the right questions when it would have been easier to stay quiet, which was, in Vivian's experience, the most reliable indicator of someone who was going to be worth teaching. After 3 days, Vivian took her into the stable. After 3 weeks, Jo was doing morning checks independently. Nate, who had claimed without irony that he was now a senior member of the operation, given that he'd been there the longest of the newer people, showed Jo the feed schedule and the paddock rotation with the particular earnestness of someone who had recently been taught things and was discovering the specific satisfaction of passing them on. Vivian watched this from the stable doorway one morning and thought about her father and about how things move forward, not in straight lines, not cleanly, but in the overlapping circles of people, teaching people, each one carrying something forward that had been given to them. She thought about the daughter Ruth Carey had told about a woman who did not stop. She thought about what it meant to be the person someone else's story was told about. Not famous, not celebrated in any way that the wider world would recognize, just known in the specific and durable way that people who did real work were known in the communities where the work happened, known as someone who could be counted on, known as someone whose judgment was worth asking for, known as someone who had walked into a stable with a sick horse and stayed. That was enough. That was more than enough. On an evening in early October, when the first real cold of autumn had come down from the mountains and the sky had the particular depth of fall skies in that country. A blue so saturated it looked painted. Vivian stood at the fence of the big pasture and watched Raven run one more time. He ran because the cold air moved him, because he was a horse in good health on open land with room to be what he was. He ran the way he had run in July and the way he would run next spring, with the specific joy of a body that had been given back to itself. Elias came and stood beside her. He had been doing this all year, appearing at the fence, at the stable door, at the porch step, at the edge of whatever moment she was in. She had been doing the same to him, she knew, showing up at the edge of his work and his quiet and his careful thinking with the same consistency. They had not made a ceremony of it. They had simply continued day after day, choosing the same direction. "She's going to be good," Elias said. Meaning Jo. "She already is," Vivian said. "She just doesn't know it yet." Nate didn't know it either, at first. No, she agreed. It takes a while to trust what you're capable of, especially when people have been telling you otherwise. He was quiet for a moment, watching Raven. I told my foreman in town today that I'd be recommending him for the Territorial Livestock Committee, he said. They've been asking for someone from this district. I told them I knew the right person for large animal oversight. He paused. I gave them your name. She turned to look at him. You should have asked me first, she said. I know, he said. He did not look particularly sorry about it. Would you have said yes if I'd asked? She thought about it honestly. Probably not immediately. That's why I didn't ask, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back with the particular steadiness that was simply who he was. Not stubborn, not manipulative, just a man who had watched her undervalue her own reach for long enough that he'd decided to push once and see what happened. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking, he said. She turned back to the pasture. Raven had slowed to a canter, wide circles in the fading light. Beyond the pasture, the mountain peaks were showing their first permanent snow of the season. White against the dark blue sky, and the air smelled of cold grass and distance. She thought about what she would tell Ruth Carey's daughter when Joe was ready to hear it. Not yet. Joe was still in the early stage, where everything was about skill and technique and getting the fundamental things right. But eventually, when the skill was solid enough to stop requiring so much attention, Vivian would tell her the thing that took longest to learn. That the work was the point, but the work was not all of it. That you could be competent your entire life and still be lonely. That belonging somewhere, really belonging, not just being tolerated or useful, but genuinely, reciprocally wanted, required a different kind of courage than the kind you used on a mountain trail in a storm. It required the willingness to be seen without the armor of the work in front of you, to let people know you and trust that knowing you was not something they would regret. Vivian had been building that courage for longer than she'd known she was building it. She had arrived in Silver Creek with $14 and a worn case and the specific bravery of someone who had nothing left to lose. She had found, in the most unlikely order, a sick horse, a dishonest foreman, a land dispute, a storm, a mountain trail, and a man who read the way she looked at a stable and understood what it meant. She had found a place with the right materials. She had built the rest herself. The light went gold, and then Amber and Raven came to the fence and pressed his nose against her hand, and Elias stood beside her in the cooling air, and the ranch settled into its evening sounds around them. The horses, the hands finishing the day's work, the particular quiet of a place that knew itself. Vivian Hartley, who had arrived going nowhere, stayed exactly where she was. It was the bravest thing she had ever done.